Stability did not disappear. It was removed. For most of modern economic history, stability was not treated as a personal outcome or an individual achievement. It was treated as a system requirement. Economic systems were designed around the assumption that large numbers of people needed to remain continuously attached to predictable income, predictable employment, and predictable futures for the system itself to function. This was not generosity. It was engineering. Work was not simply a way for individuals to earn money. It was the primary mechanism through which stability entered society. Employment anchored where people lived, how they planned their lives when they formed families, and how much uncertainty they could tolerate. A job was not a short-term exchange of labor for pay. It was a stabilizing contract between the individual and the economic system. That contract did not promise wealth. It promised continuity. For much of the 20th century, economic systems did not assume that work would make people rich. They assumed work would make life predictable. Income would arrive regularly. Benefits would exist by default. Housing commitments would make sense. Long-term planning would be rational. Failure would be survivable rather than catastrophic. Stability was not excess value layered on top of participation. It was the baseline condition required for participation to function at scale. This expectation shaped nearly every major institution. Education systems were designed around long careers rather than short engagements. Skills were taught with the expectation they would be applied for decades, not months. Employers invested in training because retention was assumed. Housing markets were structured around income streams expected to persist long enough to justify long-term debt. Banks issued mortgages on the assumption that employment would continue uninterrupted. Insurance systems assumed consistent participation. Retirement systems assumed decades of uninterrupted contribution. None of this was ideological. It was architectural. The economic system required broad, stable participation to remain viable. Growth depended on labor. Labor depended on continuity. Continuity depended on stability. If workers became unstable, consumption weakened. If consumption weakened, production slowed. If production slowed, profits declined. If profits declined, investment retreated. If investment retreated, the system itself became fragile. Stability was not a benefit layered on top of work. It was load-bearing infrastructure. As long as labor was essential to output, protecting it was rational. Long-term employment contracts, predictable wages, benefits, and pensions were not moral concessions. They were risk management tools. Stability kept workers anchored, predictable, and productive over long horizons. Anchored workers sustained demand. Sustained demand stabilized growth. The system depended on that loop. When work was essential, stability had to follow it. For decades, this structure held. Productivity increased, and wages followed closely enough to preserve continuity. Employment anchored life planning. Risk-taking was possible because failure did not imply immediate collapse. Long-term commitments made sense because income continuity was assumed rather than hoped for. In this environment, stability was almost invisible. It did not need to be explained or defended because it was embedded everywhere. People did not constantly evaluate whether work would protect them. The system had been designed so that in aggregate it generally did. Removing stability from this structure would have been unthinkable, not because it would have been unethical, but because it would have been destabilizing. Housing markets would not have functioned. Credit systems would not have scaled. Consumption would have become volatile. Growth would have fractured. The system could not tolerate that level of unpredictability. Stability was not optional. It was required. This is the starting point that must be understood before anything else can make sense. The modern system did not begin by questioning whether people deserved stability. It began by assuming stability was necessary for the system itself to survive. Protecting workers was not an act of compassion. It was a way to protect the system from its own volatility. That assumption held for as long as labor remained a bottleneck. Factories needed workers, offices needed clerks, services needed staff. Expansion meant hiring. Output was constrained by human participation. Productivity gains translated into wage growth because retaining labor mattered. Stability flowed through employment because employment was structurally necessary. When labor is essential, instability is dangerous. Unstable workers consume less. They delay commitments. They avoid risk. They weaken demand. Weak demand slows growth. Slowed growth threatens system legitimacy. Stability was the mechanism that prevented those failures from cascading. This is why stability was bundled into work rather than treated as a separate concern. The system did not want people constantly reassessing their economic footing. It wanted predictability. Predictable workers created predictable demand. Predictable demand stabilized investment and production. This arrangement did not eliminate inequality, but it constrained instability. Most people remained inside the system in ways that allowed it to function smoothly. Participation came with protection, not because protection was virtuous, but because protection was useful. This was not utopia, it was equilibrium. But equilibrium only holds as long as the underlying dependencies remain intact. Over time, those dependencies began to change. The economic system did not decide to remove stability. It encountered conditions where stability was no longer required for performance. Once that reality emerged, stability stopped being protected. That transition did not begin with collapse. It began with a quiet shift in what the system needed to function, and that shift is where the story moves next. Stability was preserved for decades because it solved a structural problem. It reduced volatility, anchored demand, and allowed long-term planning across institutions. As long as labor remained a constraint on output, that trade-off made sense. Stability protected the system by protecting workers. That condition changed. The shift did not begin with mass unemployment, automation panic, or visible collapse. In many periods, employment numbers remained strong. Jobs continued to exist. People stayed busy. Output increased. Productivity climbed. The system did not stop using labor. It stopped needing labor to be stable. This change began when productivity decoupled from headcount. Technological systems allowed fewer people to produce more value. Automation reduced redundancy. Software coordinated activity at scale. Processes replaced supervision. Systems absorbed judgment. Output increased without requiring proportional increases in human participation. At first, this appeared to strengthen labor. Higher productivity suggested higher wages. Efficiency implied shared gains. The stabilizing role of work appeared intact. But beneath the surface, the system's dependency had shifted. Once output could grow without expanding or stabilizing the workforce, labor lost its position as a bottleneck. Growth no longer required continuity. Stability stopped being necessary for performance. Labor remained useful, but it was no longer foundational. This was the turning point. When something stops being essential, systems stop protecting it. Markets reward flexibility. Firms that reduce fixed obligations outperform those that maintain them. Long-term commitments begin to look like liabilities rather than strengths. Stability attached to work became expensive. This was not a moral judgment, it was a mechanical one. Stability locked organizations into assumptions about continuity that no longer matched how value was being created. Guaranteed employment limited responsiveness. Fixed benefits increased exposure. Long-term contracts reduced adaptability. The system did not ask whether stability was fair, it asked whether stability was efficient. Increasingly, the answer was no. Once stability stopped improving performance, it began slowing it down. Organizations that carried long-term labor obligations moved slower than those that did not. Firms that absorbed volatility internally became less competitive than those that externalized it. Markets rewarded speed, scalability, and insulation from risk. Stability was exposure. The first major mechanism was risk migration. Historically, firms absorbed uncertainty. Demand fluctuated. Markets cycled. Shocks occurred. Organizations internalized that volatility so production could remain predictable. Stability for workers stabilized output. As competition intensified and cycles accelerated, absorbing uncertainty internally became costly. Fixed obligations limited adjustment. Long-term guarantees increased vulnerability during downturns. Firms that carried stability on their balance sheets underperformed those that did not, so risk moved. Employment contracts shortened. Guaranteed hours softened. Benefits detached from tenure, healthcare, retirement security, and income continuity shifted from institutional responsibility to individual management. Volatility that once lived inside organizations migrated outward into households. From the system's perspective, this was an improvement. Organizations became leaner. Markets became more responsive. Output became more resilient. Firms could expand and contract without destabilizing themselves. Workers absorbed variability so the system did not have to. Employment did not disappear. Stability did. The second mechanism was measurement. As financial markets grew more influential, the definition of success narrowed. Firms were no longer evaluated primarily by what they produced or how many people they employed. They were evaluated by margins, efficiency, and return on capital. Labor-heavy models appeared fragile. Asset-light models appeared scalable. Stability attached to labor did not appear on balance sheets. Efficiency did. Once valuation systems stopped recognizing worker stability as value, firms stopped paying for it. not out of hostility, but because it no longer improved performance metrics. What markets penalize, organizations remove. What markets reward, they expand. Stability tied to employment became invisible. The third mechanism was fragmentation. Work stopped being organized around careers and began organizing around tasks. Roles broke into projects. Projects broke into deliverables. Deliverables broke into transactions. This reduced dependency. If one worker left, output continued. If demand shifted, labor adjusted. If costs rose, commitments ended. Fragmented systems do not require stable participants. They require interchangeable ones. Continuity becomes unnecessary when replacement is trivial. Careers lost coherence. Progression became nonlinear. Experience accumulated without compounding. Each role stood alone, disconnected from the last. People worked continuously, but nothing carried forward. The fourth mechanism was standardization. As work fragmented, it was simplified. Processes were codified. Output was measured narrowly. Performance was abstracted from context. Standardized work does not benefit from stability, it benefits from compliance. Once tasks can be performed interchangeably, tenure loses value, experience stops protecting workers. Skill depth matters less than execution. Stability became cost without return. The fifth mechanism was outsourcing and vendorization. Functions once performed internally were reclassified as services. Departments became vendors, employees became contractors. Long-term relationships became renewable agreements. Outsourcing did not remove work. It removed responsibility. When work is externalized, stability is no longer the firm's concern. Output matters. Conditions do not. The system rewarded organizations that maintained productivity while shedding obligation. The sixth mechanism was benefit decoupling. Benefits were once inseparable from employment because employment was the stabilizing contract. As work became transactional, benefits followed. Healthcare eligibility became conditional. Retirement shifted from defined outcomes to defined contributions. Paid leave became discretionary. Training became optional. Employment persisted. Protection thinned. The seventh mechanism was substitution. As stability weakened, the system substituted access for security. Credit replaced savings. Financing replaced ownership. Flexibility replaced permanence. Participation continued even as protection eroded. Demand remained intact. The system continued functioning. Once participation without stability proved viable, the incentive to restore stability disappeared. The final mechanism was normalization. As instability spread, it stopped being treated as abnormal. Short tenure became expected. Job switching became standard. Risk became personal rather than systemic. Language adjusted. Flexibility became freedom. Risk became opportunity. Resilience became virtue. These were not ideological narratives. They were adaptive ones. Systems that externalize risk must normalize it to remain functional. Once expectations adjusted, resistance faded. Stability stopped being assumed. It became optional, aspirational, or irrelevant. At that point, the structure locked in. Stability did not disappear because it was rejected. It disappeared because it was no longer required. And once the system proved it could perform without it, there was no reason to restore it. That realization reshaped everything that followed. Because once stability was no longer rooted through work, it had to go somewhere else. And where it went is what comes next. Once stability was removed from work, it did not disappear from the system. Economic systems do not eliminate stabilizing forces entirely. They redirect them toward structures that preserve performance with fewer dependencies. Stability did not vanish because it lost value. It vanished from labor because labor was no longer the most efficient place to store it. This distinction matters. The system did not become unstable. People did. Markets continued operating. Firms continued producing. Capital continued compounding. Output continued growing. Nothing essential to the system's function broke. Only the pathway through which individuals accessed stability changed. For most of the 20th century, stability flowed outward from work. Employment acted as the central distribution channel. Through it came income continuity, healthcare access, housing eligibility, retirement security, and social predictability. Stability arrived gradually but reliably through sustained participation. Once that channel was no longer required, the system rerouted stability elsewhere. It moved toward position. Position does not depend on effort. It does not require time. It does not require participation. Position compounds automatically. Ownership of assets, control of platforms, access to capital, proximity to scalable systems. These became the new anchors. This is why the system can generate extraordinary wealth alongside widespread insecurity without contradiction. Stability still exists. It is simply no longer attached to work. Those who hold positions within compounding structures remain insulated. Those who rely on labor remain exposed. This is not exclusion. It is detachment. The system did not push people out. It stopped protecting them. This relocation reshaped life trajectories quietly but decisively. For most of modern history, adulthood followed a predictable arc. Education led to employment. Employment led to stability. Stability enabled long-term planning. Major decisions made sense because the future was legible. Once stability detached from work, that arc fractured. Early career no longer functioned as an on-ramp to security. Entry-level employment still existed, but it no longer established continuity. The early years became provisional rather than foundational. People worked, but they did not anchor. Mid-career no longer represented consolidation. Experience accumulated, but it did not reliably translate into insulation from risk. Employment existed, but volatility remained. Households remained exposed even after years of participation. Later career no longer guaranteed protection. Long tenure did not ensure security. Benefits were thinner. Retirement outcomes were uncertain. Continuity became conditional rather than assumed. This was not caused by individual choices. It was caused by structural relocation. The system learned it could function without anchoring lives. Once that was proven, it stopped paying for anchors. This explains a contradiction many people struggle to articulate. People can work consistently for decades and remain insecure. Others can remain loosely attached to work and remain stable. The difference is not productivity, it is leverage. Leverage compounds. Participation does not. Assets do not require renewal. Employment does. Assets scale passively, labor scales linearly. Once the system reorganized around compounding structures, stability followed them. This is why ownership became the dividing line. Housing transformed from shelter into yield. Ownership ceased to function primarily as a lifestyle milestone and became a stabilizing financial position. Rent flows provided predictability regardless of tenant stability. Appreciation rewarded scarcity rather than productivity. Those who owned housing became insulated from volatility. Those who did not absorbed it. Transportation followed the same logic. Ownership gave way to access. Leasing and subscription models preserved predictability for firms while shifting depreciation, maintenance, and replacement cycles outward. Software completed the transition. Ownership disappeared entirely. Tools became licenses. Licenses became subscriptions. Subscriptions became perpetual obligations. Capability was no longer possessed. It was rented. Entertainment followed. Media libraries vanished. Collections dissolved. Access replaced possession. Control remained centralized. In each case, the same pattern repeated. Ownership introduced finality. Access preserved dependency. Dependency is more predictable than loyalty. Predictability is more valuable than participation. Once dependency is established, stability for the user is no longer required. The system remains functional as long as access continues. This is why stability could be removed from work without destabilizing demand. Households adapted by absorbing risk privately. Debt replaced buffers. Credit replaced savings. Flexibility replaced permanence. The system did not need people to be secure. It needed them to remain enrolled. Once that distinction became clear, the structure stabilized. This produced a quiet psychological shift. Effort became maintenance rather than progress. Work became something to manage rather than rely on. Planning became provisional rather than confident. People did not revolt against this structure because it did not announce itself. It revealed itself gradually through lived experience. Expectations shrank, milestones delayed, commitments narrowed, risk tolerance declined. This adaptation was not ideological, it was survival. Over time, instability became normalized. Short tenure felt ordinary. Career changes felt expected. Insecurity felt personal rather than systemic. Language adapted. Flexibility became freedom. Risk became opportunity. Resilience became virtue. These narratives did not create the system. They rationalized it. Systems that externalize risk must be psychologically survivable for participants to remain functional. Once normalization set in, resistance disappeared. The equilibrium locked. Firms did not offer stability because workers no longer expected it. Workers did not expect it because firms no longer offered it. The system no longer faced pressure to restore what it no longer required. This is why the separation between participation and protection feels permanent. It is not a temporary imbalance. It is a completed transition. Employment persists because tasks persist. Work persists because output persists. Stability does not return because it is no longer structurally necessary. From the system's perspective, this outcome is optimal. It is more flexible, more scalable, more resilient. Volatility has been pushed outward. The system absorbs shocks without internal disruption. Economic growth can coexist with widespread insecurity without triggering correction because traditional feedback loops no longer apply. Consumer fragility does not collapse the system because consumption is no longer the sole engine of growth. Asset appreciation, financial flows, platform rents, and capital concentration sustain expansion independently of household stability. This is why markets can rise while wages stagnate, why profits can grow while insecurity spreads, why employment can exist without protection. The indicators are not broken. They reflect what the system now values. Most people sense this misalignment but struggle to articulate it. They feel productive, yet exposed, participatory, yet unprotected, employed, yet uncertain. That confusion is not accidental. The system did not fail. It succeeded. It succeeded in removing dependencies that once constrained it. Human stability was one of them. This does not mean humans are obsolete. It means they are no longer foundational. There is a difference, and once stability stopped being foundational, the question was no longer whether it would return. It was how people would adapt inside a system where it would not. That is what comes next. When stability is no longer attached to participation, behavior changes even if language does not. People continue working, they continue earning, they continue participating, but they stop expecting effort to resolve uncertainty over time. The assumption that consistency will eventually produce insulation quietly dissolves. This does not create panic, it creates caution. Planning horizons shorten, commitments become conditional. Decisions are evaluated less by long-term payoff and more by reversibility. Flexibility replaces permanence not because it is preferred, but because permanence no longer feels supported. Work becomes maintenance rather than progression. Employment sustains access. It does not anchor outcomes. This shift is often misinterpreted as cultural change or generational preference. It is neither. It is behavioral alignment with a system that no longer absorbs downside risk. When institutions stop guaranteeing continuity, individuals stop committing as if continuity exists. Understanding replaces expectation. In systems like this, effort still matters, but it functions differently. It preserves inclusion rather than producing security. Work keeps people inside the system. It does not shape where stability accumulates. This is why frustration persists even when productivity remains high. People are doing what participation requires, but participation no longer governs outcomes. The system runs on involvement without being shaped by it. That distinction explains much of the emotional texture of modern work. People feel busy but unanchored, productive but exposed, engaged but unsure. Nothing feels broken because nothing is visibly broken. The system operates smoothly. Output continues. Markets respond. Growth persists. What changed is the relationship between contribution and protection. Once that relationship dissolves, navigation becomes cognitive rather than behavioral. Those who adapt most effectively are not necessarily those who work harder or faster. They are those who stop interpreting instability as a temporary malfunction. They treat it as baseline. This does not improve outcomes. It reduces confusion. Misinterpreting instability as failure produces self-blame. Misinterpreting it as a phase produces false hope. Understanding it as structural produces clarity. Clarity changes posture. Life decisions become modular. Commitments are staged rather than assumed. Identity detaches from institutions that no longer provide continuity. Risk is managed through limitation rather than expectation. This is not empowerment, it is calibration. Calibration does not restore stability. It reduces friction inside a system where stability is no longer distributed through participation. Some patterns consistently stop working in environments like this, waiting for continuity to emerge from tenure, assuming productivity will compound into insulation, treating instability as an error rather than a feature, expecting institutions to absorb risk they no longer carry. These expectations belong to a different structure. Other patterns become necessary to understand. Stability accumulates where leverage compounds, not where effort persists. Participation sustains access, not protection. Flexibility is not freedom, but a requirement imposed by the absence of guarantees. Planning shifts from linear to conditional because outcomes no longer converge. None of this represents progress or decline. It represents alignment. Alignment does not change the system. It changes how friction is experienced inside it. The most destabilizing aspect of this transition is not insecurity itself. It is the lag between structure and expectation. People continue behaving as if the old contract exists long after it has expired. Once that lag closes, confusion recedes. What remains is a system that functions without promising continuity to participants. Work persists, jobs remain, productivity grows, but stability stays elsewhere. This is not temporary, it is not cyclical, it is not pending reversal. Once systems learn they can function without certain guarantees, they do not reintroduce them voluntarily. Dependencies optimized away do not return through effort or patience. Efficiency does not reverse itself. Stability will not be reattached to work. It will not be restored through participation. It will not flow automatically again. It will remain separate, understanding that separation does not solve it, but it ends the confusion about why effort no longer produces the outcomes it once did. Nothing was stolen, nothing collapsed, nothing is coming back. The system evolved, and in systems like this, clarity matters more than hope. For more content like this, like and subscribe.